Once upon a time, there was a kingdom like no other. A kingdom ruled by its own subjects, with no kings or queens, where the subjects were ably guided by the great warriors of the land, who protect them from every threat and enlighten them with precious knowledge that would help them become rulers of their own land. It was a kingdom that did not need a ruler. When the people of this kingdom wish to play, they make their own toys. When they wish to eat, they run their own kitchen and decide on their own menu. When they desire entertainment, they sing their own songs, celebrate their own art forms, and enact their own plays. How harmonious a kingdom would be if all the subjects worked together in unity to build it. Here is a kingdom where there is knowledge not only in its books but everywhere in the air. Here is a kingdom where responsibility is learned and shared. Here is a kingdom like no other.
Hello everybody and a warm welcome to Tapas Shala. This is our fourth edition of the virtual conference that we host to promote learning in the right way. This is to transform education across India. Vikram, I will be your host for the evening. I'm truly excited to kick off this year's Tapas Project Shala with an absolute fantastic dear friend and a fantastic speaker. Please join me in welcoming Jenny Anderson. Jenny, a warm welcome. Jenny is an award-winning journalist and she is an author. Recently, she has co-authored the book called The Disengaged Teen, helping kids learn better, feel better, and live better. Jenny, such a pleasure to have you here.
Such a pleasure to be here. Excited by what you're doing, and I can't wait to have this conversation.
I know we spoke quite a little about your book in November, but I have so many questions, and since it has launched, I think it has blown up so much. Everybody has your book. To get my copy, which I know has been sent, but it's in transit. So I'm waiting to lay my hands on the book. So I'm hoping to hear a lot about your thoughts about the Disengaged Teen. So first things first, I know you start off writing this book as it was meant for parents. You started off thinking differently about this book. Can you tell a little bit about that?
Well, the connection is not fantastic. I'm wondering if it's on my end. So I think you asked me how the book changed over the time that I was writing it.
Yes.
So yeah, we set out to write. It was very interesting. Rebecca and I set out with a very simple question, which was, how can we support the best learning? And how can we support that in schools, and how can we support it at home? And we were really focused on school design. What was it? What were the optimal conditions for learning, and how could those be scaled and replicated? And we very quickly changed gears because we realized that we were going to end up highlighting a very small number of schools all around the world that were doing wonderful things, but that most parents wouldn't have access to. And as we dove into the research and realized the tremendous influence parents had all the way through, we all know that parents have influence in the early years, and we all feel it and we know it, but we kind of feel as they get older and into high school, we lose that influence. Then it's the teacher and the content and the curriculum and the peers. Well, that's not true. Parents have just as much influence as peers and teachers in high school. We thought, you know what if we created those optimal conditions of learning at home and in school, so parents could be that bridge between school and home? And that's really the book we ended up writing, which is, how do we understand how kids engage in their learning? How do they show up for their learning? And then when they get stuck, and so many kids get stuck so much in their learning, when they get stuck, how do we all together, educators and parents, help them to get unstuck? And that's really what we created, a framework for engaging in learning and getting unstuck when they're stuck.
Yeah, and this is the cover of the book for anybody who's interested. It up, and I just wanted to put it so that all our viewers know exactly what you're referring to. So it started as a guide for schools, but then depending on the need, you evolved into something that could be a guide for parents at home. Can you tell us a little bit about you came up with the 4 modes of engagement, which is the cornerstone of this book, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that? I'm going to put up the image of the 4 modes of engagement.
Sure. I love the 4x4. Who doesn't love a 4x4, right? So these are really what we found is, and our research was very intensive. We did some qualitative research where we interviewed 100 teens, many over 3 years, to watch their journey of learning. We also did a survey of 68,000 students. This was research done with Brookings and Transcend, which is a nonprofit in the United States. 68,000 students and 2,000 parents, nationally representative, across sort of socioeconomic status and race. And what we found is the kids show up in their learning in 4 different ways. And when we talk about engagement, what we mean, I just want to make sure that we understand the term. Engagement really means the thoughts, feelings, actions, and proactivity that kids take in their learning. And they show up in 4 ways, as shown on this chart. Passenger mode is really the most common mode. About 50% of kids show up in this mode. And again, this data is in the United States, but we have looked globally, and there seems to be quite a bit of replication. But in this case, about 50% of kids show up as in passenger mode. That means they're coasting along. They're doing the bare minimum. They're racing through their homework. They're not digging into anything. They're not really, they'll do what they need to do to kind of go by unnoticed. And the challenge here really is that they are not developing good learning skills. And oftentimes they do this for maybe sort of middle school, those sort of, ages 12, 13, 14. But then by the time they get to sort of when the curriculum and content picks up, they're completely overwhelmed because they haven't really developed study habits. They haven't really developed learning habits. So that's passenger mode. And they are sort of low engagement, low agency. Achiever mode, these kids look to be fantastic. I imagine this might be a big part of our conversation because this is achiever mode kids look fantastic. Teachers love them, educators love them, parents love them because they are getting a gold star for everything that's put in front of them. So, anything they're asked to do, they want to do A+. And this is obviously something we want to encourage. We love a good work ethic. We love the goal setting. We love the sort of organization and time management that achievement-oriented kids bring. The challenge we found in our research is that these kids are very fragile learners. They do not deal with setbacks very well, and they also have not spent much time trying to identify what it is they care about in their own learning and what they want to drive toward. And so the challenge here is, as long as there's a hoop that you're putting in front of them, they can jump through it. What they don't know how to do is pick the hoop they want to get through and make a plan to get there because they're so used to sort of following the herd. So they're very good in as I said. And another challenge with achievement mode is that they have the highest rate of mental health challenges. So they can obviously tilt into unhappy achiever mode, which is really when they become perfectionists. They are aiming for perfection and not excellence. And obviously there's not a lot of room for error when you're striving for perfection. Resistor mode is in some ways the easiest mode to understand. They're kids we dub the problem kids. They are withdrawing, they are acting out. Everybody knows who they are. Teachers know, parents know. Very, very tricky mode for parents because they often feel very judged because their kids aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. these kids actually have a lot of agency. They are letting you know that things are not working for them. They are just not doing it in constructive ways. They're very tricky to handle, obviously, in terms of behavior management. But if we can kind of get to the why of why they're resisting, sometimes they catapult very nicely into explorer mode, which, as you can see from the chart there, is really where we want all kids to get. We want kids in explorer mode are agentically engaged in their learning. They are trying to shape what is happening in a classroom or at home to their own interests. They are involved in the learning process, not just in asking questions, how do I get this right, which is the kind of question an achiever would ask, but how does this relate to something I care about? Could I do this project this way? Could we work in teams? Could I possibly give a talk instead of writing an essay? Could I write a play? It is that active involvement in their own learning. And that is really where we want more kids to spend more time.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for walking us through that. And I think it's important, like you said, to understand what engagement means. And for that, we might have to clarify what disengagement looks like. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you think disengagement looks like and where it starts? I mean, what are some of the causes that teens can be disengaged?
Sure. So it starts. Most kids are really engaged in primary school. They love going to school. They love being with their friends. And there's a sort of universal acceptance that in elementary years that there is a lot that needs to be done. The kids need to develop socially. They need to develop emotionally. They need to develop academically. They need to develop physically. You know, we kind of get that all of this stuff is happening in primary school. And then they get to secondary school and we're like, okay, now it's all about subjects. Now we're going to learn our subjects and we're going to move through. And when you look at disengagement stats, literally, and again, this is US, I do want to caveat this by saying this is US data, but this disengagement data is reflected globally. In primary school, about 75% of kids say they love going to school. By 10th grade, 25% of kids say they love going to school. And we could all say, who cares? You know, they don't need to love going to school. They need to just go to school. Well, how we feel about our learning impacts how we perform in our learning and how we identify as learners. So we should care a lot. So some of the disengagement, as I said, is this kind of very complicated interplay of thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and proactivity. So in sort of wonky terms, that's the cognitive engagement is how we sort of dig in and think about our learning. And that's almost what we spend the most time in high school focused on. Emotional engagement, how we feel about our learning. This is our sense of belonging, sort of our sense of self-efficacy. Then we've got behavioral, which is very obvious. You know, are you showing up? Are you actually doing the work? Are you participating? And then agentic is this sort of proactivity. Are you kind of trying to be part of the learning, or are you just kind of following the herd? So the prime reasons kids disengage is relevance is a really big one. They don't understand why what they're learning is relevant to what they need to do further on. And that has always been, there's always been a gap between what kids learn in school and what happens in the real world. That gap is now a chasm. I mean, it has just gotten staggeringly high. And I know we'll talk about technology, but technology just means that kids sort of see what's on the other side. They see everything that's changing in the world, and they don't actually understand how what they're doing right here and now is helping them prepare for that world. And I think that sense of having to work so hard to do something that doesn't make sense to you is really contributing to a lot of the sort of apathy and disengagement that we're seeing. So I think relevance is a big one. Mental health problems is another challenge. And I do think, while I don't think technology is the problem, it is a disengagement enabler, right? It is making it worse. So kids have been disengaged from learning way longer than smartphones have been a problem. However, when you're disengaged from your learning and you have a sort of, attention distraction machine, it's going to make everything harder. So I think those are kind of the three key factors.
Fabulous. And I think that's such a valid point. And I keep telling this to parents who visit Tapas, right? That it's 19th century content that is taught by 20th century teachers to 21st century learners. And, we are looking at skills that probably they are going to use into this century. So the content hasn't really changed much in the last couple of 100 years, and that's quite it can be irrelevant for many of them. And I think it's quite sad that also when we talk of relevance, especially like a country in India, the education is so far removed from the indigenous knowledge that we have, and so far removed from what they should be learning about themselves and the roots that they come from. And it's meant to be education for a job which they may have somewhere else in the world, and so the sense of identity is so lost. And so I agree with especially the relevance part of it, and also the application, right? You spoke about doing being a large part of being engaged. And so I mean, this is fabulous. So I think all schools and all parents need to listen to this and definitely read your book about that. You did mention a little bit about technology. How do you see technology? I know you said it's an enabler more than the cause itself. But I think most parents have now deemed technology to be the biggest problem that children have. And I think there is a need to see beyond that. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I have 2 teenage girls, so I am with the parents who think that. It does feel to be the biggest problem, and it does sit in front of us. And so it doesn't really matter where it kind of sits in an academic sense. The issue is that it's right in front of us and we kind of need to deal with it. So here's the way I think about it. I think there's a big conversation happening in the US and the UK. I'm not sure how much it's happening in India right now about smartphone bans, and that it's, we've really kind of let things get out of control. Big tech has had sort of their rule of the roost, and that has been very dangerous. And I could not agree with that more. I think that is absolutely true. Big tech should be regulated. The problem is parents can't wait for that to happen, and it doesn't look like it's going to happen. So what can we do now, both to help them engage in learning, which is, I think, the question you're asking, but also to just have a healthy life, which is something all parents care about. So we really encourage 2 things. One is limits. I don't think any parent should be at all remotely apologetic about taking phones away from kids, depending on how old they are, at sort of 9 or 10 at night. They need sleep. Most teenagers are not getting nearly enough sleep. And so you take the phones away from them. If they say that they need them to do their work, they need to get their work done a little bit sooner than they're getting them done. And they can maybe parse out what they need to do. I'm not sure how much work is done on phones versus tablets versus, sort of in books. But so I think it's a conversation about time management. If you need to do the work that you need to do on your phone before 10 p.m., then that's what we're going to do. So I think this idea of protecting sleep and protecting the things that we know teenagers need to develop well. What do they need to develop well? They need sleep. They need in-person connection. So again, we're sort of articulating to our kids that they need to be with other kids without their phones. I sort of did that monumentally dangerous thing of when my 14-year-old had some friends over, I collected their phones. I mean, she was horrified. And for the first 15 minutes, it was terribly awkward. And then they were completely fine. And so it's like pushing through that to make sure you're proving to them that they know how to do that. I think time in nature, obviously, if you can, it depends on your circumstance, where you live, but just getting outside, sort of being with family, being extended meals, kind of community gatherings, all that stuff is so important to building the social fabric of resilience. That is, like, resilience is built very much on this sort of having a web of support. And so again, I think those boundaries are all about that. I mean, you're paying for the phone, probably. You do get to set the limits. And I guess the second piece of it is doing that with them. So I have negotiated with, a lot of people do this in a formal contract. I did not do that with my kids, but I sat down and said, we're going to negotiate how much time you're going to give to Mark Zuckerberg or to whatever platform you're choosing. You are choosing to give your attention to these men who are monetizing it. They are making money on you and on your attention. So I get that that's where your friends are, and I get that's a super important part of your life. So we're going to negotiate how much of your life you will give to them every day. And then I'm putting limits on your phone. But we did do it together, and we negotiated an hour and a half a day. And so that's how much time my kids get. They're 14 and 16. I wish it was less, and I do watch. And what I have noticed is I've consistently kept up with the message of showing them how I think this detracts from doing other things. I don't judge them for using it. They use Snapchat. I got on Snapchat so I could chat with them and send funny emojis, and so I can actually find them when I need to. But I also say, like, this comes at a cost to you. And I've just noticed that my 16-year-old started using Snapchat less. That was most of her hour and a half. And I said, what's going on? She's like, I just kind of think it's dumb. And I think, it's taken 3 years. It hasn't been an overnight process, but I have stuck with, I don't judge you as a person for using the technology. I know that this is your generation and this is how you guys communicate, but it's really important to me that we do all these other things and that you understand how much you're being used by these technology companies, because no teenager likes to be used.
I agree. And I love that you're coming at it from being used versus actually using social media. So I think that logic kind of sticks to a teenager more than anything else. It's so surprising, so refreshing than having to set limits without that. So, and I have a 16-year-old boy. So I think the kind of stories that you shared are very similar. I think it's great that you've been able to negotiate the time and they are able to bring that realization themselves. I think if we remove technology as the big enabler of disengagement, what are parents and schools doing to unintentionally cause disengagement? Because I think that's where the source of disengagement is.
You mean if we leave technology out of it, what are some of the other factors?
Yes.
Yeah. I say this with great empathy because, again, I have teenagers and they can be really challenging creatures. But I think the thing we probably do the most is we fail to listen to them authentically about their experiences of being young. So honestly, in almost every survey that asks young people what they want from the grown-ups around them is that they want to be heard. And they don't want to be heard in tokenistic ways. They don't want to be, sort of, what's your opinion? That's great. Kids today, they're very much shaped by the world around them, which we can pretend to understand, but we don't. And we can really only learn about from asking them. So I think this idea, there's some really interesting research by a guy named David Yeager. And, the number one thing that teenagers want is status and respect. They are neurodevelopmentally, what they're trying to do is separate from their caregiver. So they have to go out on the savannah, find their tribe. How do you find your tribe? You do that by earning respect, by doing things, right? And so they're looking for ways to earn status and respect. And so often what we see is they're sometimes frustrating behaviors, and then we judge them. And it starts this cycle of we judge, they retreat, they're defensive, and then there's no communication. And so it's really pushing through a lot of emotional regulation on our part. Try to not be judgmental. They are literally developing as human beings in front of our eyes. You see them developing as little kids, and you can be very empathetic, and they're super cute. They do dumb things, right? They, they're clumsy, or they make bad decisions, and you assume that that's okay because they're little, and then they look like us, and they still make bad decisions, and we judge them because we're terrified, and because it feels like they should be doing better, but like their brains are really still developing. I love this idea of like, there's a common phrase that life is not a dress rehearsal, but like for teenagers, it kind of is, right? They are practicing everything. They're practicing their learning. They are practicing their social skills. They're practicing romance. Like everything is like a first draft. And instead of judging them for their mistakes in this, we have to be coaching them. So I think it's really shifting from this instructional approach to invitational approach. And this can be really hard. So instead of do your homework as I told you, or you have to study for that exam because you need to do well, it's what could I do to help you get ready? What do you think you need to do to get ready, right? You're prompting them to make the plan that they need to make to get ready. I know you want to spend a lot of time online with your friends. Like, who wouldn't? I would love to spend time I wish I could spend all day chatting with my friends. I've got to go to work. Sometimes you've got to make these decisions. That's such a different approach. John Marshall Reeve, who's an academic whose work we relied on for our book, said that kids, as soon as they get defensive, put up a force field, and they can't hear you, can't receive your instruction. And so we need to think about what are all the things we can do to lower the force field, to be connected, so they take our advice, so they stay engaged, so they want to be engaged. We can't even get there if they're thinking, all I need to do is keep you out, right? That is kind of the way their brains are working. It's like, you're judging me, well, then I'm keeping you out. And so we have to keep that going. And it's really, really tough because let's be honest. I mean, they do make some really terrible decisions, but that is to be expected.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more, especially with the status part. And I think we see that the instructional part, especially in a classroom setting, can be so overwhelming because it's not invitational. In a classroom full of students, if the teacher is unable to give that agency that you began talking about, right? And that agency isn't available to them in the school setting, I think the learning is just very incomplete, and they're unable to pick up they require because they are disengaged. And so I think that's quite terrible in the schools where we don't understand that they are something today and they need to have some status in the classroom and not just outside of the classroom or at home. So treating them with respect, I think, becomes the number one thing that every teacher should be doing. So I agree that that parents have to respect them at home, and similarly teachers have to respect them at school. So
And Preeti, can I add one thing? I think
yes.
it's really important. John Marshall Reeves research, and he did 35 randomized controlled trials in 14 different countries, as varied as South Korea, which is a very hierarchical system, and Peru, which is not, and the United States, which is not. And he found that these practices, teachers don't have to lose their authority by being respectful. So I just think it's an important distinction, because I do think that there are sometimes the sense of like, okay, well, it's the US, they're very laissez faire, which they are. But like even in South Korea, which is a much more, authoritarian structure, those teachers can still have the same disciplinary procedures and the same curriculum. They still need to get through the same curriculum. But if they very gently shift their practice from instructional to invitational, from adding an explanatory rationale. I'm giving you this work to do because it's really going to reinforce your knowledge of fractions, instead of just do it, right? Like you're conveying with respect to the student, I'm asking you to do this for a reason. I'm going to articulate the reason for you, which does not take away from your authority, which does not take away from what you need to get done with your curriculum and your standards and your test. It just is a different approach to the person. So I just wanted to kind of clarify that I do think that even in classrooms where there is a teacher is very much in charge, of the class, all of this is possible. This is not a sort of, only can be done over there.
Absolutely, yeah. And thank you for pointing that out, because I think even in India, it's quite hierarchical and authoritarian as compared to the West. So I think that's a great example. I see that in our classrooms at Tapas, because when we do the classroom agreements, it's invitational, and the learners are coming in and talking about what what they think should be the rules of the classroom that they are in. We have the town halls where every week the learners meet and discuss what is the problem that our school faces, and then they figure out the solutions for it. So I think we're encouraging citizenship versus consuming the content. That's the difference, I think, largely when it comes to a project-based learning school like Tapas, and maybe a conventional school where it's okay, this is the content I'm being given by the teacher, and this is how I'm consuming it, and this is how I will write my exams, versus I am an active participant in my own learning. So that's the difference I see.
Yeah, all of those make such a difference. I definitely think sort of morning meeting or town halls like that, especially when you actually give real decision-making authority to the kids, not to run the school, not to decide the curriculum, not to, you know what I mean? It's to make some decisions that affect their lives, around maybe what they eat for lunch or when they do things, or like that kind of stuff it just changes how they show up for their learning, which then changes the power of their learning.
And our school is still young. Our oldest is 12 years old. So I can't comment on the teenage part yet. So maybe it'll be a very different conversation when I have with you 2 years later. But I'm hopeful that what we've set up now will kind of help us into the teenage years as well. So again, the next question, I think, is something that's on everybody's mind. It's so new to everybody, and nobody knows how to navigate this. What's the role of AI, and is it causing attention spans to be shorter and shorter? Is that real? What is your take on how AI is going to affect engagement in our teens?
I think the truth is we don't know yet. It's still kind of fairly new. sort of ubiquitous in one way and kind of extremely new on the other. I think, like all tech, I think the mistake we made with almost every technology that has come along, from smartboards to laptops to smartphones, was assuming it could be used for good, and that was the default assumption. And so sort of plowing along and then kind of dealing with the consequences. I think in education with AI, we just need to be more cautious than we are sort of like running headlong into it. I think we've seen the impact of smartphones. That wasn't a great choice to run headlong into that without asking the consequences of it. I think we need to be very careful. I think AI will unleash will have the ability to unleash incredible agency in learning. I think it can be a tool for developing that agentic engagement, but that is going to require sort of careful scaffolding and testing, and teachers being on board with that process. So you use the example of, I would use the example of, a student is choosing to write an essay, and using ChatGPT, they are using that to cheat effectively, right? To be compliant and to be as disengaged from their learning, as disengaged as humanly possible. Do this for me, right? That is using AI not for good learning. If you then said, I am writing a paper on, sort of the origins of cancer, and you are using ChatGPT to help you identify some of the best sources to go look for, to help me find 6 videos online about the origin of the cell in cancer, that stuff, then it is an agentic use of it. It's going to be a very fine line. I think the problem is all of this is going to come down to the learner. And so the learner has to believe that developing their own learning skills, their own internal drive, is the most important thing they do. And then we can trust them and help them. We'll scaffold the process and help introduce tools that are agentic, introduce projects that encourage agentic learning. You can do all of that, but at the end of the day, these kids will be at home alone with their AI at some point. So it's really, how do you develop the value of learning, the principles of good learning, understanding that it is hard. Learning is hard. And if you just make it easy all the time, you're not going to become a good learner. Unfortunately, kids too often think like, but it could help me get into university, or it could help me get good grades. And if the goal is the grades, then the technology could potentially help. Maybe not on exams, but right, it's going to help them with the papers. It's going to help them in the short term. I think we need to develop this kind of, what does it mean to be a good learner? It means that I can struggle with learning. I can push through hard things. I can ask questions. I can go find answers from people. I can marshal the resources to go find out a question that I care about. But it all starts with caring. I care about getting the answer. I care about getting to the answer, and technology will be a piece of that, and people will be a piece of that, and my community will be a piece of that, and my parents will be a piece of that. But again, we have to really reinforce that becoming a good learner is really the core of it all. And from that values and principles base, then obviously we have to, I hope there is some useful vetting of the actual AI and, privacy concerns, all that stuff. That's sort of in a different realm. But when we're talking about the student themselves, that's really what I worry about, is how do you create a kid who cares enough not to cheat? Because the cheating is getting easier and easier.
Absolutely. And I think so what you're saying is, if I'm going back to your 4x4 model, the model of the 4 modes of engagement, you're literally saying we move away from achiever and into explorer, because achiever is the one who will want to use AI for getting their grades, getting into institutions. So they're so oriented towards that goal of a university and a job versus actually learning. So the person who's interested in learning will be the explorer and not the achiever.
And really, parents play you've designed a school that creates a culture of wanting to learn. And I imagine parents who are joining your school feel this way. It's a brave choice right now, because the system is still in some ways very much not set up for that. And clearly the future is going to reward people who know how to learn themselves and not the learning itself, because the AI will be able to do that, right? AI is going to be able to do all the things, all the exams, and whatever the ITT exam is, like the AI will be able to do that. But will people, what are the problems that we're going to choose to solve in the world, and who has those skills, right? And so I do think that there is something to be said about this is fighting the good fight, which is really redefining what good learning is.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the reasons why we started something like Tapas Project Shala, because bringing about that education that is much required in the parenting community and in the teaching community about what's available and what the future looks like is the very reason that we started the Tapas Project Shala. And I'm so happy you said that because it's not easy to be where we are, uh, blowing our own paths and trying to be different and at the same time trying to meet the needs of the learners that we have. So it is a little difficult, but we have the support from people like you from across the world. We're doing all right.
Yeah, and it's like I said, I think it requires bravery, but I also think it is like its time has come, because I think it's, how much the hoop, there are a lot of hoop, right? We've basically designed education as a bunch of hoops. And we basically said, okay, the hoops are a little higher and more kids are trying to get through them. And at some point it just doesn't work, right? Like education will at some point become deciding what hoops you care about and then getting through and making a plan to get through those hoops. And that's not to say that, of course, all along the way, there's going to be hoops kids have to jump through. That is just the nature of education. They have to learn numeracy. They have to learn literacy. They have to, so all of those things, knowledge is critically important and no one is discounting that. It's how do you get there? And do you lose them along the way? If you're getting to your knowledge and they end up hating learning at the end of it, you really have kind of lost the game. But if you, get the knowledge and you've created a sort of curious, motivated being, the world is your oyster. So I think it's very much about that sort of journey in between.
Absolutely. And I'm going to tell the viewers now that we are open for questions, and any of the questions you can type into the comment section and it will appear on our screen here. So if you have any questions for Jenny, please do type them out and we will continue our conversations while you type out your questions. Jenny, if there's one thing that you think a parent should change in the routine of every day, what's that one change that can really catapult this kind of engagement?
I'm going to say two. You asked for one, I'm going to give you two. Only because one is reiterating a little bit of what I've said, and the second is, I think, a little bit different. So the first one is no nagging. There's this wonderful study that we have in our book of, it's a neuroscientific study, and they put teenagers in a brain scanner, fMRI machine, and they watch their brains as they hear a recording of their mother saying, there's one thing that bothers me about you, which is, and basically the mother is nagging the child to do something, and it shuts down the problem solving part of their brain. So I articulated this earlier. So, but when you say one thing, I think if we can, again, not nag, do less nagging and more nudging, we are going to become more successful. And again, I understand that this is hard because I have teenagers and I nag them all the time. So, it's not as if I've totally nailed this. I think it's very difficult, but I think sort of as much as you can, that just doesn't work. I mean, it doesn't work. It shuts down their brain and they're incapable of solving the problem that we're nagging them to solve. The second thing I think is be the bridge between the content of school and the real world. We know way more about how the world works and what's happening out in the world. It doesn't really matter if you, you work in your local community or you work in a global multinational organization. At any stage, about way more about the world than your child does, and you can help be that bridge between the content they're learning in school, the projects they're doing, the chemistry they're doing, the physics they're doing, the maths they're doing, any of that. You can be the bridge between that and the real world. And so if the relevance is the problem, you being the bridge, and you can use ChatGPT to do this. This is a great use for, AI. I am constantly listening to what my kids are doing and saying, how can I incorporate this into conversation? And then I do. And it's just a way of both validating the work they're doing in school. You are saying to them through your conversation, what you're doing is important. Tell me more about this. I hear you're doing a project on that. Does that mean this? Does that, oh my gosh, you're studying, waves. Well, that's relevant for chemotherapy. And, that your uncle's in having cancer treatment, and that's chemotherapy. That is the most important research that's ever done. So much is happening in that conversation that is conveying to them that they are doing important work, that you are kind of interested in it, and that you can kind of connect it to the real world. So be the bridge.
Fabulous. And now the final question is, what do you recommend that maybe one or two things that teachers should do in the classroom?
So John Marshall Reeve identifies 7 practices. So I'll go through maybe 3 of them. And we've talked about one of them, less instructional, more invitational. Invitational language, honestly, is so powerful. Instead of do this, might you, would you, could you, maybe we could, all of that just sets a different tone. It is inviting them into the learning space. I think having this sort of activating of their brains at any given point. So when a class starts, if you think about it, you sit down and everybody's like, they take their binders out, they take their books out, and it's time to focus on a lesson, and the teacher starts. Kids know that they can go into passive learning mode almost immediately, and most of them will tune out. And so if you start that lesson by, I would love we're doing a lesson on the solar system today. I would like 3 people to give me some questions that they have about the solar system. What's something you want to know? They're suddenly like, I have to think, and they have to be agentic, and they have to sort of consider this for themselves. So I do think that sort of prompting and start with engagement. And then I do think this explanatory rationale, really explaining why you do what you do. And teachers are very good at this, way better than parents, right? So they constantly know how to chunk things and explain why you're doing things and connecting the lesson to learning outcomes, but even more, right? So I am asking you to do this homework because I really want to consolidate your knowledge around, some piece of Indian history and really articulating that for them. So they're constantly seeing the why. You were not doing this because you're mean, which is what they often assume, because you're inconsiderate, because you don't care about their time. It's because you actually really believe in them and you really think this is hard work, but I know you can do it.
Yeah. And I think that's easy enough. It's not something that the teacher has to consciously do or put in a lot more effort. It's easy enough if we do it slowly but surely, consistently. Keep doing that. I think these are small changes that's not going to affect the teacher too much. So that's fabulous. Thank you so much. One question that.
Oh yeah. Go ahead.
So sorry.
No, I just thought of one more that teachers love, which is students love, is an exit ticket. When you leave the classroom, if you have a question at the end of class, if something wasn't answered or wasn't clear to you, write it on a piece of paper and hand it to the teacher. And the teacher can pick 1 or 2 of those to address. And it's a way of the student saying, what I don't understand matters. And the teacher to then kind of actually get a pretty real pulse on whether what they're teaching is settling the way they want it to.
And plan for their next instruction. So I think that's fabulous. One of the parents, the question is, what signs should parents look for that might indicate their teens are struggling with disengagement?
Sure. So I think really very little articulation of what they're doing. I think parents are always asking the question, what happened today in school? What did you learn? If you're getting very little feedback on that front, that could be a sign that they're disengaged. I wouldn't do it right after school. I think kids come back from school and they're quite tired, but I think maybe you get to dinner time and you're asking about school and you're not getting anything at all. If you see them really racing through their homework and not engaging in it very well, I think if they can't answer many questions about what they're doing, if you say, oh, I know you're studying atomic theory, tell me what that is. What have you learned so far? And they kind of can't come up with it. I think that's a sign that maybe, they might need a little help engaging. It could also mean that they don't want to answer your question. So it's entirely possible that is the question, which is where we get back to the invitational and the not judging and the really trying to scaffold that. But those are some key things. I think with achiever mode kids, one of the signs of disengagement, and this is they really don't know why they're doing what they're doing. So they take every setback. You get a 99% and it's devastating to them because they could have gotten 100. They get I think that's a sign where you have to sort of dig in and say, hey, like learning is always going to, of course, we love the perfect scores, but learning is hard. And this is a journey. This isn't a sign of a moral failing of yours. This is a sign that you're learning, right? Like, so there was something in the test that you didn't understand. That's what happens when you're learning, right? And so it's really encouraging that sort of process of learning and not just the outcome. So that would, for achiever mode, and like I said, with resistor mode, you know that they're not engaging because they're withdrawing or they're acting out. So they're very easy passenger. It's that racing through things, not digging in, they often say, how was school? Boring. What did you learn? Nothing. What did you do today? I don't remember. Like, that's classic disengagement. And then achiever mode is this sort of that's struggling with even very, very high marks or good grades.
Super. I think that kind of answers the question, and there's a lot more. And I recommend that everybody digs into this book and learns a lot more about what has been spoken today evening. That's all we have time for today, Jenny. It has been a pleasure learning from you. I think my one key takeaway today is not instructional, more invitational. So I think that has been like the theme of this conversation. And as an educator, that's a big takeaway for me. And I hope as a parent as well, I'm able to practice this at home. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. If we receive any more questions after this, can we send them to you and you can respond to them? We can put that back.
Of course. I'd be happy to. And thank you for all the work that you're doing. Honestly, you're building something very important. And I hope parents realize that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for all that. Looking forward to meeting you soon. Take care. Thank you so much, Jenny.
Bye.